everyone, it's Alice, and today I'm going to talk about the books I read in October. I had a pretty good reading month. I never get to as many books in October as I want to. There are so many books that I would like to read during October because it's one of my favorite months to read books, and I never get to as many as I think I'm going to, but I did manage to read 7, which I am pretty happy about, and most of them were autumnal ones that I really wanted to read during fall, so I am happy with my reading. I also read some really good books this month, which is great. We have a lot of books to talk about though, so we're just gonna jump straight in. The first book that I read and finished was Madam by Phoebe Wynne. This is a gothic mystery type book with a little bit of horror to it, and it's set in the 90s at this 150-year-old boarding school for girls, and this boarding school is really mysterious. No one really knows what goes on there, but it's very prestigious. And the main character that we're following is a new teacher at the school, and she's the first teacher that they've hired in over a decade, so it's a really big deal. It's a great opportunity for her, and she goes and she sort of slowly unearths what the school is actually doing. Now, this is a book that I remember the first time I heard about it, I was like, wow, that sounds perfect for me. But then I looked it up on Goodreads and it didn't have great ratings, and I saw some reviews that were very mixed, so I was like, maybe it's not that good. But I couldn't get it out of my head and I still wanted to read it, so I just got a copy, and I ended up really enjoying this, actually, more than I thought I would, I think. I think the setting of the school is excellent and it's very atmospheric. It's in this windy, gloomy, isolated place, and it's such a good setting. It has really gothic vibes, which I love. I also like the tension of how this new teacher gets there and people won't tell her things, and it's very clear that things are being kept from her, and she's curious and she's asking questions, but people won't tell her things, and there is a tension to that I really liked, and I liked the build-up of it. The main character that we're following is a classics teacher, and she teaches some of these girls about these Greek myths, and we get to read about some of the myths, and they sort of tie into the story in a way, but I really like that they were there because it sort of sparks these discussions between the teacher and the students, and I really liked that part of the book because there's a lot of hints in those conversations, and through them things are sort of being revealed in a way, and I really liked those conversations because it's a big part of the theme in a way. And I did really like sort of the main character. She's not the best main character that I've ever read, but I like her place in the story where she's coming to the school and she's having a lot of her views challenged, and she's really struggling with it, and she's not perfect. Sometimes she's not as strong as she should be, sometimes she's really unlikable, but I really liked that sort of struggle. And I know that some people from having read some reviews didn't like that because they felt like she should have been stronger and she should have done more, but I actually really liked that she had a really hard time, and she does to a certain extent try to conform, because to be honest, that is what most people would do, but then she gets to this breaking point and it's just too much for her. And I just really liked the buildup of it and her sort of struggle and this tug of war with her trying to conform but then staying true to her own views. Now, this is a little bit of a longer book, and I would say that it is on the slower side. Now, I'm the kind of reader who usually enjoys when these kinds of books are a little bit slow because I don't know, I just feel like it adds to the atmosphere and the build-up, and I feel like it fits these kinds of stories. But I do think, looking at it in hindsight, it is a little bit repetitive in parts, and I think that the pacing is not perfect, so I can see that some people wouldn't get on with it. But when I was reading it, I didn't really notice it. I was just like, yeah, it's a slower book, but I'm really enjoying it. I also really liked the ending, which I know that a lot of people don't like, but I can't really see it ending any other way. Maybe I'm just not that creative when it comes to thinking of other endings, but I feel like the ending fit quite well. It is maybe a little bit convenient, but I quite liked it. And overall, I did just really enjoy this book. It's a very solid book for me. I was intrigued, I was surprised, I love the atmosphere. I'm not gonna lie, the atmosphere did a lot for me, and I am the kind of reader where atmosphere can almost carry a whole book. So it might be that as well, but I really enjoyed it. It felt like a solid book to me. 4 out of 5 stars. I will say though, I also enjoyed Catherine House, which is a book that a lot of people don't like, and I think it's just with these kinds of books, you have to just be into the vibes in a way. And maybe I'm just the kind of reader who really likes these kinds of books. I do think if you liked Catherine House and to a certain extent Bunny, you would like this because it does have some of the same like vibes to it. Secondly, I picked up one of my witch books because of course I did. I read Cackle by Rachel Harrison. This is a contemporary fantasy supernatural kind of book, and I've heard people say that it does have a little bit of horror to it. Maybe it does, but it doesn't really feel that way, at least not to me. But it's a contemporary paranormal book about this woman who moves to this absolutely beautiful small town after a breakup, and she's sort of restarting her life. And this town is really picturesque and it seems perfect, and the people are really friendly. And she becomes friends with this woman who everyone in the town sort of seems to fear a little bit, and people warn her against her, but she becomes friends with her, and she lives in this huge weird house, and it seems like maybe she has some abilities, and you know, maybe she's the town witch. I say that because it is like super obvious very early on, but I love a good witchy book. I can never get enough of these kinds of books, and this is one of those where I had seen it around quite a lot before I got it, and I'd heard sort of mixed things, so I was a little bit like, I don't know. But with any kind of witch book, I do always want to give it a go, so I got it, and I feel like I'm glad I read it, but I understand the mixed reviews. Like, there were some things that I really enjoyed and some things that didn't work as well for me. My favorite part of this book was definitely the small town setting, like the way that it's described. It just seems so lovely and charming, and it's just like the perfect small town. And I really liked that, but I also like that you get a sense pretty early on that there's something lurking beneath the surface, and there's something that is a little bit off. And I liked that as a sort of backdrop. I feel like it's the perfect backdrop for these kinds of stories. I did also quite like the magic in here, even if it wasn't fully explained. It was pretty cool. And there are some horror scenes in here. I think that for me, this doesn't feel like a horror book because the vibe is just like not a horror book. But when I think about it, there are some scenes that are definitely sort of horror because they're very disgusting. It's not scary. It's more like creepy and weird and just like a little nasty, I guess. But I do think that those things are horror scenes for sure. And they are a little bit gory. But for me, I think because of the vibe of the book, this just didn't feel like horror. I think it feels more just like a contemporary paranormal book. But I guess those scenes could be a little bit disturbing. But yeah, I was probably wrong in saying that it's not horror because there are some pretty disgusting horror scenes in here. I think my main gripe with this though is that I just didn't feel like the characters were well done. They felt very one-dimensional to me, both the main character and the side characters, and I just, to be totally honest, I didn't care about them at all. And I also felt like I didn't fully understand them, and there were things like choices that were made that I just didn't really understand, and I just didn't feel any kind of connection to them. And I don't know, they felt very one-dimensional to me, and they didn't feel like fully fleshed out characters. As someone who is a reader where characters is almost like the most important thing, I sort of knew halfway through this book that this wasn't going to be any more than a 3 out of 5 star read for me. And I just sort of went along because I did really like the vibes and I liked the magic and I wanted to know sort of what would happen, but I wasn't like super invested. And I think for me, these kinds of books are only ever going to be like something that I read and enjoyed because if I don't have any characters to latch onto, I don't feel super connected to it. But I read it, I liked it, and yeah, I enjoyed it. But that's all it kind of was. Then I picked up a book that I got very recently. It's The Broken Girls by Simone St. James. This is a mystery novel, and it's the kind of book that has two timelines. One is set in 2014 and the other is set in the 1950s, and both of them are set in Vermont. In 2014, we're following this journalist who is obsessed with her sister's death. Her sister was murdered and she was found in a field outside of the school. And in the 1950s, we're following four girls who are attending the school when it was still open. And this school is basically like a boarding school for any unwanted girl and anyone who's like illegitimate and troublemakers, girls who ask too many questions. Like, it's that kind of school, and the school is really horrible. And how these two timelines sort of come together is the mystery, I guess. This is a book that I have been recommended by a lot of you, and it's an author that a lot of you have recommended to me. And so I got this book, and I gotta say, I had pretty high expectations going into it. I was very excited, and I feel like my expectations were definitely met. One of the reasons that I thought I would like it is that it has a sort of like dark academia vibe. It at least has an academic setting, and I thought that the setting was really, really good. Like, the whole atmosphere of the school and the surrounding town, like, I could really picture it, and I thought it was great. And I really like how this book gets progressively darker throughout it, and I was surprised by how dark it got and how haunted this place is. Now, when it comes to books with two timelines or more than one timeline, I've said this before, but very often I will end up preferring one over the other. But for this one, I was actually super invested in both timelines, which I really loved. I loved seeing the characters and getting to know them, sort of slowly unpicking them. And I really enjoyed the mysteries because there is more than one mystery in here, and all of it was just like very intriguing. I also just really like the writing, and I like how the characters were crafted, and it was just really, really good. I totally understand why a lot of you recommended both this book and this author to me, and I definitely want to read more of her books because I really, really liked it. Like, all of the elements were really well done. It might be one of my favorite books that I've read this year, but I don't actually know what to rate it because, as you might know, I'm very stingy with my 5-star ratings, but it's like somewhere between 4 and 5 for me. Maybe a 4 now, and I'll bump it up to a 5 later. I don't really know, but I really, really enjoyed this book. I thought it was really, really good, and I definitely want to read more from this author. So if you have any recommendations for what to read next, I would love to know. I feel like she's written a book. I can see the cover. It's like a motel or something, and I've heard good things about that book, so maybe that will be my next one. But yeah, if you like sort of academic settings and horrible boarding schools and like gothic vibes and some haunted things, this is a great read, and it is actually perfect to read in November. This book is set mostly in November. It's fine to read it anytime, and it was fine to read it in October. But if you have this book and you're wondering when to read it, November is like the perfect time because it's between that like fall and not Christmas, winter time, and it's in that in-between space, if that makes sense. It was really good though. I would really recommend it. Then, because that book was a little bit spookier than I thought it was going to be, I wanted to pick up something a little bit lighter. So I read How to Solve Your Own Murder by Kristen Perrin. And this is a mystery novel on the sort of cozier side or like lighter side of things, I would say. And it's about this aspiring writer who is summoned to this little like quaint English village where her great aunt lives that she's actually never met. But there's something about like an inheritance and she wants to meet. And this aunt has spent her whole life trying to get away from this fortune that she was told when she was young. And that fortune told her that she was going to be murdered. And then this aspiring writer gets to this English village. And of course, the aunt is murdered. And so she has to try to figure out what happened, and like, was it murder, was it an accident, what happened? And then there's all of these intrigues in this little town, and there's something about the will, and it's a whole thing. But basically, this main character has to try and solve what has happened. This is a relatively new release, and it's a book that I've been excited about since I heard of it. And then I got it, and a lot of you shared your thoughts about this book with me, and I think that that actually helped me quite a lot because I know that this has gotten some mixed reviews, and I'm glad that you shared what you thought, because if not, I would have gone into this book with like really high expectations. And because a lot of you told me like maybe manage your expectations a little bit, I did. And I think because of that, I actually sort of ended up enjoying it more than I thought. Does that make any sense? I don't know. But I did really enjoy this. What I expected when I started this was just like a mystery on the cozier side of things, or the lighter side of things. I wasn't expecting it to get like super dark or all that like intricate or anything. And I was expecting this small English village to be a great backdrop, and I feel like that's what I got. I also thought that the characters were quite interesting. They're not the best characters that I've ever read about, but I did enjoy them. And I like that we have this current day perspective, and then we actually have diary entries from the 1950s about the aunt and like things that happened back then, and that adds context to the story and it adds a sort of layer to it. And I really liked that, and I love the atmosphere of this little English village. But then again, you can't really go wrong with a mystery novel set in a small village. Most importantly though, I really enjoyed reading this book. Like, I had a good time reading it, and I actually ended up reading this whole book in like 2 big chunks because I just really enjoyed it. There's something compulsive about it, and it's really easy to get into and really easy to read. We do actually also get 2 mysteries in here which sort of tie together, which I really enjoyed. And yeah, there are maybe like a tad too many characters in here, I would say, and not all of them are all that well developed. But then again, because there were so many characters, it made it more difficult to figure out, so I guess that was a good part about it. It did also take me a little bit of time to get used to the narrative style, like the voice of it, but once I got into it, I really enjoyed it. Is it the most like mind-blowing mystery that I've ever read? No. Was it enjoyable and a lot of fun to read? Yes, definitely. So for me, yeah, it was good. And I feel like it really helped me to manage my expectations, because I went into this not expecting much at all, and I almost expected to be disappointed. And because of that, I think I ended up enjoying it more. I think definitely going in with the right expectations is a good idea for this, but yeah. It's somewhere between a 3 and 4 star read for me. I might actually tip it to 4 because I did enjoy this like so much. And the fact that I read this in 2 sittings, like, I very rarely do that. So maybe we'll give it a 4 actually. Moving on, I picked up something totally different. I read A Tempest of Tea by Hafsah Faizal. This is a YA fantasy novel, and it's about this, like, it's set in a fantasy world, and it's about this criminal mastermind and her gang. And she is running this like tea room that turns into a blood house for vampires at night, and that blood house is illegal. And the story sort of takes off when her establishment is threatened, and she has to do this sort of like heist in order to save it, and she has to team up with some unlikely people to sort of get this thing that she needs to get. And yeah, that's basically the book. We go on this sort of like heist slash quest. So this is a book that I've seen around a little bit, and I'm not gonna lie, the cover really drew me into this because I think this cover is amazing. And I'd say that I went into this with sort of medium expectations, in part because I'd heard mixed things, and in part because YA fantasy for me, like, I do enjoy reading it sometimes, but it's usually like not my favorite, and usually it doesn't like blow me away. But it's great when I'm in the mood for it. And I was just hoping that I would enjoy this, and I definitely did. I'd say that reading this was overall just fun. It's a pretty fast-paced story. There's some vampires, there's magic, there's an interesting fantasy world, and I enjoyed it. I do usually enjoy books with like quests or heists though, so it's no surprise that I enjoyed that part of the story. It's not the kind of book that I feel will really stay with me though, if you know what I mean. Like, it has a cool fantasy setting, but the characters feel a little bit one-dimensional to me, and especially like For some of the characters, it makes sense that we're not exploring them that much, but for the main character, I wanted to get more under her skin, and I felt like I didn't really. And I do think that some of the interactions between the characters are really good, and there's some fun banter, but I wasn't really invested much in any of them, if that makes sense. I also got this thought in my head in the middle of reading this book, and when I thought it, I couldn't unthink it, and I couldn't sort of unsee it. But I think that this book is just trying too hard. It's trying too hard to be exciting and romantic and all of these things, and I think it would have been better if it was a little bit more relaxed, because I feel like this book, especially in certain scenes, it's just like trying too hard to make you think a certain thing or feel a certain thing. And I think it would be better. And this is a thing that I think about a lot of books. Like, it's actually one of my least favorite things in books. But like, I think you have to trust the reader to have an emotional response to something, or to sort of feel a certain way about a character. You sort of have to relax a little bit. And I think it was just trying a little bit too hard to be cool. And I didn't really love that. Also, there is a thing that happens at the end that I felt like was really obvious, but when I read some reviews after I'd finished this, a lot of people found that to be really shocking, and that was like a huge twist. But for me, I thought that pretty early on in the book. I was like, I wonder if this is what's going on. And because of that, the ending probably wasn't that impactful for me, I guess. But yeah, I enjoyed this. Like, it is very fast paced and it's like action packed, and there is like a lot of cool elements to this, but it just feels like, again, the kind of book that I read, enjoyed, that's kind of it. I do think that this is the first book in a series that I don't feel like I would continue on with the series. I had a good time with this, but that's kind of all it was. So for me, it's a 3 out of 5 star read. I do still love this cover though. Some YA covers are just so good. And yeah, the cover is really good and the book is enjoyable. Second to last, I read another witch book that I know a lot of you love, and loads of you have recommended it to me. It's Slewfoot by Brom. And this is set in Connecticut in the 1600s, I think 1666 or something. And we're following this woman whose husband dies very early on in the book, and she's left to fend for herself, and she sort of lives outside of the village at this farm, and her brother's husband is trying to take the farm from her, and there's a lot about that, and she's trying to keep the farm, and then in the middle of this, she runs into this newly awakened creature that might be able to help her. This is a book that I've had on my radar for a couple of years, and you all know I love a good witch book, and this came highly, highly recommended, and I totally see why. I really, really liked this, although I will say it was spookier than I thought it was going to be. It's no surprise that this worked so well for me. It has interesting characters, both human and non-human. It has magic, both witchy and not witchy, and it's set in a great historical setting, and it's set in a time when people were, at least in this setting, people were really, really religious, and there's a lot of stuff around that, and it's the middle of like the witch hunt times, and I don't know if it's actually in the middle of the witch hunt times, but it's in that sort of around that time. And there's a lot of interesting stuff around that, and there are a lot of different elements to this book that I liked, and a lot of different sort of discussions and themes. I also really like how the book becomes progressively darker. Like, we start off, and yes, there are some spooky things, but it's not that bad, and then throughout it, it gets sort of darker and darker. I really like when books do that. And there are some horror elements to this, but it wasn't too bad for me. Like, as you may know, I get pretty easily scared, but it wasn't too bad in here. There are some disturbing things, I would say, but yeah, it wasn't too bad. Although I guess towards the end it does get pretty violent, and there are some things that happen that are pretty horrific, but it's the kind of horror where, like, it is scary, but it's not the kind of scary that makes me scared to go to bed. Does that make sense? Like, it wasn't that scary. It was just more horrific and a little gory. And I would say that this book is sort of deliciously dark. Like, it's that kind of horror. It's not, I don't know. It didn't make me want to sleep with the lights on. You know, it's not that kind of scary. The atmosphere in here is just great, and the vibes are just excellent. And I think I mentioned this when I hauled it, but this does have illustrations in the middle here. And I thought that was a cool element, but I didn't think much more of it when I bought the book. But actually, having these images really sort of informed how I pictured everything in this book. I don't know if I would have pictured these like creatures in this way if I didn't have these illustrations. And this is very much the vibe of the book, and it really helped me to sort of picture everything. Does that make any sense? I don't know. I feel like it does. I loved the vibe. I loved reading this book. I did take my time with it because it was that kind of book for me, and I really, really enjoyed it. I do have one slight thing though, and it's that I don't know if it's just me, but I thought that the pacing was a little bit off sometimes, and I don't really know why. It just felt a little bit like choppy in certain parts. I don't know if that's just me though, but that is my only complaint about this book. Like, the rest of it was great. I really enjoyed the writing. I loved all of the settings and the characters, and yeah, it does get pretty dark towards the end, but I felt like the build-up was really, really good. To me, this is a 4 out of 5 star read. Maybe it should be 5. Again, I'm very stingy with my 5-star ratings, but yeah, it was really, really good. I totally see why so many people recommend it, and I would recommend it as well. Just like, be aware, there are some horror things in here, so it really depends on how much horror you can sort of deal with. And there is like some violence and stuff like that, but overall, very interesting, very enjoyable. Perfect to read in October. Lastly, I squeezed in one more book in October. I actually read this when I went to bed on the 31st, and I read it all in one go because it was just that kind of book. It's What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. This is a gothic fantasy horror type book, and it's actually a retelling of The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. It tells the story of this retired soldier who goes to the house of their childhood best friend because they've gotten word that the friend is dying. And so they race to this house, and they get there, and everything is super weird. There's something wrong with like everyone in the house, and just everything around the house. It's a nightmare, and it's just horrible. Now, I have read that story by Poe. It was years ago, but I sort of knew what to expect going into this, and I was expecting like a similar type story and these like amazing gothic vibes, and I definitely got that. I also just knew that I was gonna like this book because I really like this author. I'm becoming more and more obsessed with her, and I just love everything she writes. So I kind of just knew I was gonna like it. I think one of my favorite things about this author is just how she weaves together fantasy worlds and how she's able to create them in her shorter books as well. And I feel like in this, we mostly spend time at this house, and that is like the main part of the story. But we learn a little bit more about the world outside, which I really loved, and it sort of informs the backstory of the characters, which I really liked. I've also mentioned this several times, but there's always humor in this author's books, like dark humor, and it is present in varying degrees in her books, but it's always there, and I always really love it. I also really like the characters that we meet in here. They feel very solid for such a short book. Now, I knew that this was a horror book, and I knew it had something to do with fungus because it does mention it on the back, and there are mushrooms on the cover, so I was like, I bet like this is what's going on, like fungus is a huge part of this. But I don't know why I was so surprised that it was so horrific, because it is a horror book, so it's kind of dumb to go into it not expecting horrific things. But here I am. But like, it was spookier than I thought it was going to be. Again, I felt like I could deal with the horror quite well. It wasn't like super scary, but it is like pretty nasty, and it's like really unsettling. Like, it has this unsettling feeling to it. And there is a little bit of gore in here, and there is like some really disturbing scenes. One in particular with these rabbits and this, oh, it's so bad. So it is a little graphic and pretty grotesque, but yeah, I guess I enjoyed it. It does fit the story very well. I do really like the whole thing with the fungus though, like where that goes in the story. I did really enjoy that, and I thought it was a cool twist on the original story. So it was pretty cool, but also pretty disturbing. And one of the reasons that I did read this all in one go was because I was like, ooh, I think I just need to finish this and have it be over, because one, I do need to know what happens, and two, I just want it to be over. I want them, like, them to get away so that we're gonna be okay. But yeah, it was, yeah, interesting. This is the kind of horror that I think that I like though. Like, this is an okay level for me. I could see that this is maybe too much for some people though, and I do think that if this had taken a different direction, it would have been too much for me, or if it was like a longer book. But I think I could deal with it because it was in such a short format. But yeah, overall, I really liked this. I feel like it was the perfect book to finish my October reading with, and it's a 4 out of 5 star read for me. It's also the first book in a series, which I'm very intrigued about. I wonder what the next book is about, but I definitely want to read it, which isn't that surprising because I kind of want to read everything this author has ever written, and I keep buying her books. But then I feel vindicated in my choice to buy so many of her books because I always love them. They're just so good. Okay, that was the last book though. Definitely a good reading month. I feel like I got to some really great October books, and I'm really glad that I read them in October. I did read more horror than usual, but it was pretty fun. I feel like this time of year is just perfect to read those kinds of books, so that was great. Now, I'd love to know what you all have been reading lately, and I'd love to know if any of you have read any of the books that I mentioned, what you thought. Tell me your review in the comments, and that was kind of it for today. As always, thank you very much for hanging out with me today, and I will see you soon. Bye!